It is 3 o'clock Central. You are part of Security 501, the evolution of monitoring and response. I think we had it titled XDR versus MDR. I'm Susanna Song, moderating today's session. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications at Overwatch and at Highwire Networks. We're glad everyone's here with us. If you look at the chat box, I mentioned that today we're going to do things a little differently. We tried it out already twice today. David's already been pretty busy with a 10 a.m. session, and we just had one 2 hours ago at 1 o'clock. And we opened everyone's microphones. It defaults to mute, so you don't have to worry. Like I'm turning everyone's microphone on. And if you have the urge to ask them a question because things are not making sense, or you don't want to forget, or if he's on a particular slide, feel free to raise your hand or just interrupt. David's been awesome and very flexible with people's questions. So without further ado, David, our Chief Technology Officer, I'm going to hand you the mic and have you start today's session.
All right, thank you, Susanna. Welcome everyone. Good afternoon. I recognize, and I always like to start with this because it's sincere. I recognize you guys are all busy and that you're taking time out of your day to hear me ramble about various topics, and so I appreciate that you do that. Hopefully, you'll get some value out of this. We wanted to add in and make this a little more interactive. So as Susanna mentioned, we turned the microphones on. If at any point you have questions or you go, that doesn't make sense, or what the heck were you thinking, feel free. Right? I've done this plenty of times. I don't mind being told I'm wrong. Although with this content, I hope I'm not, because I've been doing it a while. So we started off with the idea of just talking about XDR, but I think there's value in understanding the evolution of where we've come from. But before we do that, just some high-level things about Highwire. I'm not going to read them all. I think a couple points to note is we've been around about 20 plus years. We are really a three-part company. Part of that is security, Overwatch, which is what we're going to talk about today. If you want to know more about what we do, we're happy to walk you through Highwire as a company. But I think the thing to note is we do consulting work, we do hands and feet. I think last year we were in 160 countries maybe, or something like that. We've got folks everywhere. So if you need hands and feet somewhere else, we got it. If you need wiring, well, that's part of our legacy as well. Whether it's internet wiring or power, we do those type of functions as well. So without further ado, and again, I'm not going to read all of that. We've got it available if you need it. What I want to talk about is where we began, what is MDR, EDR, XDR, and why is it important? Why do we care? So I want to start with about 15 years ago when I was working at Sprint, Kansas City. We built one of the first MSSPs. We built a managed security services program for Sprint, and we were actually managing firewalls for our customers. I think at one point we had 500 pairs of firewalls that we were managing across the globe. And it didn't look like this room. But it was our first foray into, and really my first exposure to managing risk for a third party. And the truth is, when it all started, it started very limited compared to what we have today, and I'll talk about that in a minute. When I went to work for AT&T, I was in their New Jersey office back when the headquarters was in New Jersey. And I was in a customer meeting, and there were about 40 of us in the room. And I don't know how many partners and customers, but it was basically a dog and pony show. And so at some point, we're talking, and when you walk in, well, let me back up. When you walk in the room, it's got a conference table that'll seat 40 people, right? You just don't see that very often. And off to the right is a large curtain. And the curtain's probably 30 feet long, maybe longer, but it's a long curtain. I remember that part. And so we start our meeting and we're talking, blah, blah, blah. And the AT&T person says, would you guys like to see it in action? And we said, yeah, great. So they hit a button and the curtains separate. And what you see is what's on the screen right now. It was the operations center for AT&T, where they were managing managing risk and networks and everything for their customer base across the globe. And that was amazing. It was so cool to see what they had built. I was telling somebody the other day, I think that probably sold customers just opening the curtain. Hey, come look behind the curtain. And people see it and go, oh yeah, you guys know what you're doing. Let me buy your product or your service. So it was really cool. Now, the thing to note here, and it'll be relevant a little bit farther, if you see the two analysts here in the front, now they probably have at least 5 monitors each. When we stood up the service at Sprint, I think the average user had 6 monitors, some had 9, right? And imagine if that's your job to watch all those monitors. It becomes a pain at best. And that's relevant because we're going to talk about it. So how it all began and where it began was really in this blue box. We had system logs, right? Very few server logs at this point, but it was more firewalls. We were just starting to cut our teeth with the IDS. There really, there was no endpoint. There was no antivirus. There was no proxy or email gateway. None of that was going into our security operations center. It was pretty much firewall up, down, and we made changes to firewalls. And so all of the data in this upper box, upper left-hand corner would go into a SIM, but even that was very rudimentary. For all practical purposes, it was log storage / log aggregation, right? There was no AI, there was no machine learning, and it was painful at best to try to recreate out of this monitoring system anything of value. But we had to do it, right? People wanted to do it. People wanted to know that we were doing it. That was really where it started. And so it started the evolution to MDR. And I'm not going to read this to you, but I think what this should tell you is this is where we're starting to see more and more companies pop up who say, I will manage your security for you. Effectively, and depending on who you talk to, what school of thought they come from a risk perspective, you're shifting the risk from an organization to a third party, right? As a security practitioner, I never agree that the risk shifts, because at the end of the day, my customers are going to hold me accountable, even if I've hired someone like Dell SecureWorks to manage it for me. So MDR in its infancy, and even somewhat today, is really that first box that I showed you on the previous slide. MDR is really some logs, a few firewalls, but you don't typically see the bigger picture. You're seeing a subset of the picture. So MDR has evolved to some extent to EDR. EDR, again, I'm not going to read it, but is endpoint detection and response. EDR really was vendor specific. So what we saw happen was we saw companies like CrowdStrike and Carbon Black and McAfee and Trend Micro coming out with endpoint detection and response, which is great if all you have in your network are endpoints. And I would argue that there's not a single company I know that doesn't have some other form of compute power, cloud, on-prem, web-based, SaaS. Everybody's got some version of computing that isn't tied to an endpoint. So the EDR, the downside to an EDR approach is all I'm getting is endpoint data. Now, some will tell you that's pretty good. And if that's all your customers doing, then they're doing great. But they could be better, right? There's things they're missing. If they have any compliance programs they have to adhere to, EDR by itself is not enough. So we'll transition to XDR. XDR, for practical purposes, is a combination of MDR and EDR, and a little bit more, where we're looking at all data. So the X in this case stands for everything, right? The detection and response, which means we're going to bring your traditional EDR data. We're going to bring your MDR stuff. We're going to bring stuff that doesn't fall into either of those camps: software as a service, cloud, network addressable resources. We're going to bring that data in, and we're going to normalize, correlate, integrate, and build response programs around those, right? So what that looks like and why that's important, let me see what my next slide is. Why that is important is now here in the middle, this is XDR. And we're pulling in system logs and alerts. We're pulling in network traffic. We're pulling in software inventory, hardware inventory, user information, and we're creating a correlated event that's got visibility across your entire network. I will tell you, as a security practitioner, one of the things that I have to have is visibility, because I can't protect something I can't see. Which leads us to the second part of the conversation is I need to be able to reduce how long it takes for me to see the bad behavior, as well as how long it takes to respond. And those are called, in our world, mean time to detection, mean time to response. What those two stats lead to is the most important one, which is what we call dwell time. If you haven't heard of dwell time, it's really just a function of when did the bad guy get in, when did we kick them out, and how long did they live in your environment. So why that's important is a couple stories I'll tell you. The industry average for dwell time, Verizon puts out a report every year. It's a State of the Union, basically, for InfoSec. And they report on what the dwell time is for all of the breaches that they've seen through the life of the last year, the last decade, whatever. And the last number I saw was about 192 days. So what that means is the bad guys get in, and they're in there for 192 days before they're caught and kicked out. Right? Catching them doesn't mean that I apprehend them, by the way. It just means I found that they're in my network and I need to get them out of my network. I would argue that in 192 days, there's nothing left that I want. If there's any value, I've already taken it, right? So dwell time is key. Now, I'll tell you a story. I went to the company I worked for got acquired by a government contractor. And so I was CISO for this company, and he was CISO for this larger parent company. So I was in his office one day and we were talking, and I said, hey, what kind of metrics are you tracking? What are you sharing with the board? He says, Dave, I'm only using one metric total. I'm like, okay, great. What is it? And he said, dwell time. And we started talking about dwell time. And he says, how long do you think our dwell time is? What do you think a good number is for me to report to the board? And I said, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours. And he says, our dwell time is 30 minutes. 30 minutes is huge, right? In a 30-minute window, they detect the bad guy, and they've quarantined, isolated, mitigated, remediated the problem. That just doesn't happen in most organizations. Now, understand the government contractor does classified work, has some requirements that none of us ever will see, but it's a great target to shoot for, right? So we in Overwatch, we have a SLA that says for critical events, we've got a 15-minute window of which to respond. So we're driving and pushing to get that mean time to detection and mean time to response as low as we can in support of our customers' needs. All of that's relevant and only possible if you've got correlated, normalized, visible data that I can look at. Does that make sense? Any questions before I keep going? All right, I'll assume no. Feel free again to interrupt. So the benefit of the XDR platform. So as I talk about this, there are two other vendors out there right now. If you go search XDR, you're not going to find a lot, but you're going to find two big vendors who have really started to champion this. One of them is Palo Alto. The other one is Trend Micro. And what they've done is they have a initiative called XDR, but it's limited to their products. So if you're a 100% Palo Alto shop, then their XDR is fantastic. Or if you're a 100% Trend Micro shop, you're good to go. But I have yet to find an enterprise or even a small company that has 100% of any one vendor. So the challenge with those other two platforms, those other two vendors I'm referring to, they don't do well ingesting Cisco products or Fortinet. Why would Palo want to ingest that data? You know, their answer is going to be, well, just swap out your Fortinet with a Cisco or a Palo Alto product. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's just not going to work. So we approached it a little bit differently and said, let's make ours open. So when you get our service, you get about 18 functions, or 18, we call them apps. But then you plug in your own apps, and those apps are firewalls, right? So to us, a Cisco, a Checkpoint, a Palo is a firewall, and that's a firewall app. So we don't care who makes it. We're going to ingest it as firewall traffic. And what that's going to do is let us, basically bring all that collection of data, normalize it, correlate it, enrich it, reduce it, deduplicate it, and then run it through analytics, right? Those analytics are 7 types of machine learning that's going to help us identify what's important out of these haystacks of data, right? Because that's the problem is, if you think about this closed ecosystem that Palo Alto built, they're not allowing for you to go buy best of breed. And in some cases, don't get me wrong, Palo Alto has some best of breed products, but they don't have the best of breed everything. There are other endpoints that are better than traps. There are proxies that are better than their proxy that you get with a firewall. So there's reasons why you're not going to be in one product camp. Having said that, there's no way outside of a platform like ours to think about the breadth of products that an enterprise is managing. I saw a statistic that said the average number of security controls, and when I say controls, I'm talking about products, that an enterprise has to manage is 45. So a $200-300 million company is running 40 to 50 security tools, right? They can't afford to staff all those. They don't have the skill to manage all those. And without a platform like ours to integrate and correlate across those, they're not going to have the visibility they need to focus on dwell time, right? To focus on mean time to detection, mean time to response. This is where XDR and our Overwatch platform shines. So the other point I want to make on this slide is this whole idea around context. And I share this story a lot. So if you've heard it, I apologize. But when we think about context, imagine it's Friday night, you've had a long day of work, it's 10 o'clock, you're sitting in your easy chair, and you see somebody walk by outside. Maybe they're on the street and and they've got a flashlight, and you don't think much of it, right? Because you've got controls in place You got doors, you got roofs, you got walls, you've got dogs, you've got guns, you've got whatever controls you need, and you feel safe sitting in your easy chair in your living room. So let's change the context to it's Friday night, you've been working all day, it's 10 o'clock at night, you're driving home, and as you pull up to your house, all the lights are off, but you see the flashlight inside your house. And oh, by the way, all the neighborhood has power. So context is just flipped. And I would argue that context with anomaly data is critical to identifying those needles in the haystack, right? So when I see that flashlight in my house and I'm outside of my house, I'm going to be nervous. I'm going to wonder what the heck's going on. I'm going to call 911. I'm going to do whatever. That drives risk. So context is key. And then having context will help us differentiate between anomalies that are bad and good, right? So as you think about a user anomaly, so for example, I live in Nashville, and in 2 hours my account is used in Europe. Yeah, it's not possible, right? Unless somebody has my credentials. So our XDR platform is going to say, hey, this is an anomaly, and we have to derive context and make a decision. Is it good anomaly, bad anomaly? Sometimes we don't know yet until we look at other context. Maybe the reputation where my credential is being used is from somebody who has a reputation of being a brute forcer, right? Context says it's worse. So now it becomes something that's maybe a low risk. The risk score starts to change. Without context, without visibility, you can't derive risk. So that's where XDR is coming in. The other thing that's interesting is if you go back to that very first slide I showed you of the network operations center, right? There were 5 or 6 monitors on a desktop. It's impossible to manage all of those with one person and be good at it. With this approach, I have a single console, which I'm going to show you, where I can manage and monitor everything, right? So if you look up top, the first line defenders is really, I should change that to say security controls, because those are the tools on the right. Those are your firewalls and your endpoints and your CASB and your cloud data and your vulnerability and threat and server and network, and all of that are your first line of defense. And they all kick out logs and packets and API data, which goes into our data lake. And in that data lake process, we're normalizing and enriching and reducing and deduping the data. And then we're giving it to machine learning, where the analytics are taking over. And those analytics are driving responses back to those controls. Was there a question? I'm sorry. Thought I heard one.
Right. David, did you have a question? David Wadley?
I think my phone just went off with a text message and made a noise.
No problem.
Wanted to make sure.
Sorry about that.
No, you're good. Just wanted to make sure. So this model of this workflow says my controls are sending data, the data lake is ingesting and making the data better, and then we're running analytics against that data, which is leading those controls to be able to take action. This is the integration. This is XDR. This is why it's different. This is why it's better. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and stop my share, and I'm going to pull up the interface itself. I think I am. There we go. All right. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
All right, cool. So what you're looking at is, what I haven't told you yet, I forgot to mention, our security operations center is based in Batavia, Illinois, which is a suburb outside the west side of Chicago. This is the interface that our security team uses to manage risk. So what happens is all that data that we talked about from that first drawing I showed you is feeding this tool, this platform. This platform has a bunch of apps or functions that are running. You know, we've got machine learn IDS, we got network traffic analysis, we got a malware sandbox. Ultimately, all that data is coming in and getting correlated and categorized in this arc. And this arc, if you're not familiar with it, is the Lockheed Martin kill chain. And what Lockheed Martin did in 2011 is said every attack we've seen has got some characteristics that we can categorize and then start building controls to protect us. And so they categorize these according to risk. So from left to right, you've got reconnaissance activities, you got delivery, exploitation, installation, command and control, and finally, actions and exfiltrations. This is the one that nobody wants to talk about. This is where, or you hope that you don't ever see. Data is leaving your network, right? So this is typically a bad thing. And so being able to categorize according to risk allows us as a SOC, an operations center, to focus on what's highly important, or what are my critical events that I need to pay attention to. So this is what we're using to do that. Now, I would argue, and I will tell you that even though these low risk items have some value. So I'm going to show you that. I'm going to talk about user login failures right here, right? So if I click on this button, what we'll find is in the last 24 hours, we have an interval of 24, there were 200,000 login failures. Now, most times we'd say, that's a lot, but it's a fail, so why do we care? Well, almost every successful hack in the world started with a fail. So if we're keeping track of the fails and we get some machine learning and some AI on those fails, we might be able to detect before they become successful, right? So that's the theory. So let's go see how that theory plays out. Using machine learning, I've evaluated these 200,000 events, and I tell you there's two that are critical. So let's go ahead and filter those out, and then I'm going to walk you through the first one. The first one is a event score of 54, source host. It's a known brute forcer. Remember I told you we add some context? That's one of the context pieces. Sometimes that context is country. Where's it coming from? Where's it going to? What type of detection are we seeing, and what application are we seeing it on? All of that is context. So I'm going to click on this more info and pull up the data behind it. And if you remember, context is key, right? So imagine somebody comes to your door and they ring the doorbell, right? Or they knock. There's not a lot of risk to that conversation or to that activity. But imagine then it's at someone else is at your door and they've got a sledgehammer and they're trying to get in, right? There's context, there's intent. So when we think about that in this particular anomaly, in a normal 5-minute window, I typically don't see any of these fails. But in this particular anomaly, I saw 240 in a 5-minute window, which tells me somebody's actually actively trying to get in. So as an analyst, I see this intent, right? Because I'm using that intellect that I have with the machine learning and all the AI to come up with, I see these numbers, I see the risk score, I see what they're trying to do. It's not somebody who's walking by or standing at the door knocking. They're at the door with a sledgehammer. So I'm going to take an action. Now, from here, I could just send an email to the team. But what's more important is I can take an active response. So I can say, I want to go to the firewall, the perimeter firewall. I'm going to put that IP in there. I'm going to put a block in place for 5 hours. And what happens is our tool, again, remember, we we see these firewalls as an app, not as a Cisco or a checkpoint, but our tool knows how to talk to them. So what happens is my analyst doesn't have to be a checkpoint expert or a Palo Alto expert. They have to know how to run the tool, which will then talk to those firewalls and make changes on behalf of our customers. Now, we're not making big rule changes, by the way. What we've done as part of an onboarding is we've said, let's build a blank rule that's a block rule, a deny rule, but it'll have no IP information in it. And what the tool will do is when it gets this, when I hit submit, it's going to talk to the firewall. It's going to put this IP in that block rule that we've already established. And now the firewall is blocking that traffic, right? So I've just taken an active response to an active threat. And I've done it from a single pane of glass. Again, this is the value of having an XDR approach across all of my security controls. Any questions there? All right. So I'm going to show you a couple more things and then we'll wrap this up. So number one, we've added a feature recently that I like to show, which is really a good dashboard for your customers to see, right? So we have this event changes, or basically, what are we calling this? Company trends. So over the last week, we've had a 4% decrease in events. Our average risk score has been 46. And as we scroll down, we've got other changes over the, our average score went from 0 to 15, private to public exploits, CNC connections went down, et cetera, et cetera. This is a great tool, right? Even if it's just for you guys to keep an eye on your customers. The other thing I didn't talk about that I'm going to make sure I show you is the platform was built up front to be multi-tenant, which means I can put 1,000 customers here. Each customer is unique. So if I'm a Coca-Cola customer, I cannot see what's happening up in all tenants or down in Reed Street, and vice versa. You as our partner, we've set this up so you can see all of your customers, but you can't see anyone else's customers. What we see as your security operations center is we see everything, right? What that lets us do is a couple of things. Number one is it lets us learn from one customer and apply those learnings everywhere. So if a bank in Canada finds a vulnerability or a threat, an indicator of compromise, we have that ability then to take that and push that to everyone at one time. And now everybody's watching it. Two, I think the more important is the response piece. So about 2 months ago, there was a ransomware event that happened to Cognizant. Cognizant, if you don't know, is about a $10 billion company. So they're pretty big. They've got a very sophisticated team of security folks. I know a few of them. But they had a ransomware event. And they published their findings so that other people could pay attention to it as well. And so I took those findings and in a 5-minute window, I went up into this search box and I typed in those IOCs and I ran that search against every one of my customers in less than 10 minutes. And the good news was nobody had been impacted by this ransomware. The second thing that I did was I went and created an automation that says every 5 minutes, I want you to look for these indicators of compromise across all of my tenants. And if you see one, I want you to open a new ticket in the Security Operations Center. I want an email. I want a text page. I want whatever I want on the automation side to happen so that everyone knows we've just experienced a ransomware event in one of our customers. Again, if you think back to the mean time to detection, mean time to response, what we've just done is reduce the impact of a ransomware event. That make sense? All right, I'll assume the silence is yes.
Yeah.
What questions do you have?
I was wondering how much sharing of data between your system and others is going on. Sharing of threat information and stuff.
So threat intel, yes. We don't share customer data per se, but threat intelligence we share, because one of the things we do is we get about 12 different threat intelligence feeds as part of the platform. And so if we see something new from a threat perspective, everyone gets it, right, by default. But on the flip side, customer A is not going to see customer B's data. They're not going to see their reports, their users. It's all completely independent and isolated from each other.
Mm-hmm. Is that sharing ethic pretty well industry-wide?
Sometimes, there are folks who think that their data is better than others, and so they don't always like to give it away for free. Two of the feeds that we get are commercial feeds, by the way, that we actually pay for, and we give it away to our customers because it's really a good feed, and so we want everyone to have it. So instead of you going to pay $10K for your organization a year, we actually just split that out across all of our customers, and now everybody's getting this high value, high fidelity. What's the right word? Not cultured. What's the word I'm thinking of? Basically, it's all been vetted. It's vetted threat intelligence.
Mm-hmm. So when we get into national actors and foreign governments and stuff, there must be quite an art to knowing what to trust and what not to. I mean, I can see fake security news.
Yeah, you definitely could, right? There's no doubt about that. The good news is that the IOCs are typically, file types, file hashes, that kind of stuff. And so, I think to your point, if I'm a bad guy, I could potentially introduce something as good when it's really bad, which again is why there's multiple feeds, and we pay someone who does all of that curation. That's the word I was looking for.
Mm-hmm.
Someone to curate that threat intel before it gets to us, which means it's getting curated before it gets to you. What other questions do you guys have?
If not questions, any observations or anything that you're intrigued by, or anything even on this dashboard that you see that you would like further explanation on?
Well, I'm sure I'm not the only one who's wondering about how expensive it is. When I see what it's worth, I assume that it's pretty expensive to get on.
That's a great question, David. And the truth is, it's far less than what you might think. So what we do, and we can actually talk pricing individually, but we sell per user, right? So for example, some of our competitors will tell you if it's not a $2,000 a month MRR, then we don't want anything to do with it. And we said, well, that puts a whole lot of small companies out who really need it. So we built the platform so that we could sell it in 10 user chunks if we wanted to, right? So you're paying a per user cost to us, and then you're adding your margin on top of it and selling it to your customers. So I have seen folks sell to their customers anywhere from $30 to $50 a user, right? And we're still getting our margin and you're getting yours. So there's, it's really not as expensive as you think. From a deployment perspective, what we do is we have a network sensor that we would ship. It's the size of an Apple TV box, right? It's not very big. And you would deploy it in your customer's environment. And we would work obviously with you to get that deployed. And then it starts collecting data, right? All this data we're seeing is coming from a network sensor or a server sensor. And we would work through run books, and we would just say, here's how we're going to respond. And you're going to give us, what you need from us from a reporting perspective. We'll build that out. But, I think the short answer to your question is it's a lot more affordable than what you might think.
Mm-hmm.
And we can talk actual pricing if we need to offline.
Yeah. Well, I'm not there yet, but I appreciate that overview. It gives me some idea.
That leads also to, do you have a minimum user count for package or?
Well, we don't have a stated minimum. What we typically do is with our partners, we think about the total opportunity, even though you may not be able to bring everyone on. And so from a pricing perspective, you may say, I only got 5 with this customer, and we'll give you pricing for 5, understanding that those 5 might be a little bit different from a pricing perspective than 100 or 1,000. But what we typically do is we'll give you the price point for your total opportunity, right? So, and I don't know if I'm not a sales guy, by the way, so I'm just going to tell you what I think. Let's say you have 1,000 users that you manage across 20 companies, so that's 50 each. And you had one company that was 10, and you said, hey, I want to do 10 right now, and the end of the year we'll add another 500. We'll give you that pricing for 500 for the 10, and you could sell them right now. Now it doesn't, I can't tell you it makes sense for 5 users, but we could do it. We just have to figure out what works.
David, another enrollee has asked, I'm curious what the deployment looks like in the customer's network.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I mentioned earlier, we have a server sensor and we have network sensors. So our deployment is typically, and our process is typically, you come to us, say, hey, we got this prospect, they want to do this. So we ship a box. It's that Apple TV size box. They plug it into a SPAN port. They plug it into a network jack, and we connect it back to the data processor, which is what you're looking at. And we start gathering traffic, right? And it automatically starts categorizing and correlating and all that fun stuff. They may tell us that they've got 3 servers they want to add to, so we connect them to the download, and they download the 3 server agents. They get them running. We turn those on, and now we're collecting Active Directory and DHCP data and DNS traffic. So, the truth is we can stand up a POC in a couple hours. And then once we prove the POC, the value is there, the customer agrees, we turn it up into production, everything stays in place, and we move forward.
Do you must have some prerequisites? Like if I want to hire a security guard, but I don't believe in door locks or any of that stuff, it's a bigger problem for him than it is, if I'm reasonably secure-minded myself. Do you have some prerequisites that you expect from customers before you can protect them?
Prerequisites are tough because everybody's different.
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you that we've had one customer that we said, you know what, we can't absorb the risk of owning the risk for you, and so we actually didn't do business with them. And the customer didn't want to monitor everything. They said, hey, just put it on 2 firewalls, but all of our other security controls that are granting access to the VPN, whatever, we don't want to see that. We don't want you to see that. And you know, at the end of the day, our team, so we have a very, very skilled, passionate security team, you know, here in the US. And we see ourselves as part of your team and part of your customer's team. And so if we're not in this together, then we don't want to be in it at all. And so prerequisites, maybe not the right term. For us, the right term is, do we have an objective that we want to help protect you? And if we're all on that page, it may be different for each customer because what they deem is enough is different, right? How much security is enough for customer A is different than customer B. Having said that, you know, we'll find a way to work with you and work with your customers.
Okay.
Anyone else? Well, if you do, you know, email me, feel free to call me, whatever. Happy to answer questions. Happy to go into more depth if you have folks that need to see this that are potentially more technical, or you want me to talk about it from a sales perspective, how you pitch this, I can do that too. You know, I led with, I appreciate your time and your attentiveness and paying attention. I know you're busy folks, and at the end of the day, if we can do anything to help, just let us know.
Thank you, David. And yeah, I echo what he said. You guys will get an email from me tomorrow. So if you guys need me to connect you with David, I'm more than happy to do that. 2 weeks from today is our 502 session on vulnerability assessment and patch management. If you haven't registered for that, please do so. That will be led by our Director of Product and Strategy, Dan Herring. So until then, I hope you guys stay healthy and safe. And again, if any questions pop up, please reach out. Have a great rest of the day. Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Great presentation.
Thank you, guys. Have a great day.